Hi guys, tonight we begin with a question you've probably never been asked. Why did noblewomen in ancient Silla shave off their eyebrows? For ghosts. You're probably curled up somewhere cosy, thinking about soothing things like hot chocolate, or that one cat who dreams of fish and ignores your texts. But tonight, I want you to imagine waking up in a world where your eyebrows weren't just decoration, they were an offence to the dead. Welcome to Silla, an ancient Korean kingdom older than your grandmother's favourite kimchi recipe. A place where gold sparkled in tombs and silence echoed louder than wars. A place where women took blades to their faces, not to impress men, but to impress spirits who might be silently judging their bone structure from the afterlife. Not exactly relaxing, is it? And yet, somehow, it is. Because there's something soothing about history when it's weird, quiet, and just distant enough not to be your problem. So before you get too comfortable, take a second to like this video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Let me know your location and local time in the comments too. I love seeing where you're listening from. Now then, turn off the lights, maybe switch on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's slip into tonight's slow, strange journey. You're standing in a small ceremonial chamber. It smells faintly of burning herbs and wet stone. The floor is cold beneath your feet, and the only light comes from a bronze oil lamp flickering on the altar. It makes shadows dance on the wall. One of them might be yours, one of them might not. In front of you, a hand-polished bronze mirror rests against a carved stand. It's old so old it doesn't reflect you properly anymore. You can barely see your outline. Just the blur of your face, a ghost looking back at you. Maybe that's the point. Someone approaches, a servant in ceremonial robes. They carry a small blade wrapped in silk. You already know what happens next. You close your eyes and feel the first scrape, then the second. Both eyebrows gone. Your face now looks unfinished, like a sentence that trailed off, a painting left in the rain. But that's the whole idea. Your body is not yours tonight. It's an offering, a canvas scrubbed clean for the ancestors to visit. Because in Silla, hair wasn't just hair. It was spirit-charged matter. And eyebrows, they were thought to be like spiritual antennas collecting energies, memories, and probably judgmental glances from the beyond. So when you needed to purify yourself, to be worthy of speaking to the dead, you silenced your face. The blade did the talking. Some historians still argue whether this practice was purely spiritual or whether it was also tied to social status. Was it a show of devotion or just really intense peer pressure from religious aunties? We don't know for sure. But we do know that eyebrow shaving was recorded in royal rituals, mourning ceremonies, and seasonal offerings to ancestors. Women, especially those from elite classes, were expected to do it. No questions, no eyebrows, just duty. Archaeologists have even found tiny razors in the tombs of noblewomen. Some of them are engraved with cryptic messages, things like for ritual eyes. Not for eyes, but ritual eyes. Which raises several questions, none of them relaxing. In one royal funeral, over 300 palace women shaved their brows in unison. They stood in rows, silent as stone statues, weeping not out of pain, but out of reverence. Because in Silla, grief was a performance. The dead were the audience, and your body was part of the set. Oddly enough, the absence of eyebrows didn't make a woman less powerful. In fact, surviving artwork from Silla shows these browless figures as dignified, almost serene. No shame, no attempts to redraw or disguise, just a blank gaze as if to say, I see things you don't. Things like ancestral disapproval and possibly hair regrowth serums. No one dared mock it, not even the men who had their own weird beauty rituals to worry about. But we'll get to those. And here's a fun fact to consider while you drift. In some rituals, even mirrors were feared. They were thought to trap spirits, or worse, reflect the wrong version of you. So shaving your eyebrows in front of one, that was bravery, or lunacy. Maybe both. It was never about beauty, it was about belief. A belief that your face could offend eternity if it wasn't properly neutralized, that your body was a message and every strand of hair was a word that could be misread by the gods. Sleepy yet? Good, because we've only just begun. One eyebrowless footstep into a golden kingdom full of quiet madness and sacred grooming habits. Next up, we're diving into how this shiny little kingdom stayed alive for nearly 1,000 years while everyone else around them self-destructed. Hint, it involves more silence, more incense, and possibly a forbidden shade of face powder. But that's tomorrow night's worry. Tonight, just know this. You'd never survive as a noblewoman in Silla. But that's okay. You don't have to. You're just here for the whispers, and they're only just getting started. The kingdom of Silla wore gold and silence. You wake to silence, but not the lazy, cozy kind you might know. This is sacred silence, the kind that carries weight, the kind that presses gently on your ears and makes you think twice before breathing too loud. You're in Seorabeol, the capital of Silla, what we now call Gyeongju. But tonight, it's just the city where gold sleeps. The buildings are low and watchful. The mountains sit behind them like patient gods. Even the birds outside the palace walls seem to chirp more quietly, as if rehearsing reverence. Silla didn't roar like Rome. It didn't burn like Babylon. It whispered. And somehow that whisper carried for nearly 1,000 years. While kingdoms rose and fell like unstable Jenga towers across Asia, Silla outlived them all, surviving political backstabbing, courtly drama, external invasions, and probably some extremely boring meetings. It was one of the longest-standing monarchies in human history. And it did it all in hushed tones. You would think a kingdom that lasted that long would have conquered half the continent. But Silla preferred not to. Instead, it practiced the ancient art of staying very still and looking very expensive. Gold crowns taller than your head, golden belts with charms that jingled when you bowed, and golden burial masks with thin, eerie smiles. The elite of Silla didn't just wear gold, they became gold, even in death, especially in death. They buried their dead in massive earth mounds that looked like quiet hills. You could live next to one and never realise you were neighbours with a general, a queen, or a concubine who once started a scandal over sandal colour. The tombs didn't shout their importance, they just were, like all things Silla. And it wasn't just the burial that was silent, it was the daily life. Royal decrees were issued like haiku. Court rituals lasted for hours, and everyone was required to stand still and say absolutely nothing, unless spoken to by someone at least 2 bone ranks higher than them. That's not a metaphor, that's a real thing. See, Silla ran on the bone rank system, a hereditary caste structure so detailed and petty that even your earlobe thickness might offend the gods. Your rank determined what kind of house you could live in, what jewellery you could wear, how high your hat could be, and most tragically, how many folds your ceremonial sleeves could have. Some people literally lost arguments over sleeve count. Historians still argue whether this system helped maintain order, or just made everyone too afraid to breathe wrong. Some believe it preserved harmony. Others think it just ensured that no one ever had enough freedom to start a decent rebellion. Either way, it worked, until it didn't. But we'll save that implosion for another night. Back to now. You're sitting in the outer gardens of a noble home. The grass has been combed. The stones have been washed. A single cherry blossom drifts to the ground like it's apologising for existing. In the distance, someone is walking across the courtyard. Not stomping, not strutting, just gliding. You don't hear them. You only know they're there because of the faint clink of golden hairpins. This is how power moved in Silla, not in parades or explosions, but in delicate footsteps, in gold that whispered, "Don't forget who paid for this silence." It wasn't all peace and grace, of course. There were palace murders, poisoned tea, exiled queens who definitely kept diaries, and rival kingdoms, Baekje, Goguryeo, Tang China, always testing Silla's patience. But Silla didn't respond with armies. at least not right away. First, they responded with poetry. Yes, you heard that right. Before going to war, the Silla court often sent poets, not to negotiate peace. No, to craft insults, beautiful, devastating, passive-aggressive poems designed to make your enemy doubt their ancestry and their haircut. They didn't attack your walls, they attacked your pride, and only when that didn't work came the swords. Of course, beneath all that quiet gold was a strange twitchy fear of the gods, of the dead, of the ancestors who might be watching from behind the clouds and grading your life like a midterm essay. That's where all the rituals came from. The eyebrow shaving, the mirror rooms, the hair-burning festivals. It was all part of the same game. Keep the dead happy so they don't come back and ruin your harvest. So Silla kept the candles lit, kept the silence, kept everything symmetrical and scented with incense. Even their timekeeping was quiet. Instead of bells, some palaces used water clocks, delicate bowls that filled drop by drop, marking the hours with a whisper. Tick-tock, but make it poetic. It's tempting to romanticize it, isn't it? A world of silence and symmetry, of power expressed in posture, of gold worn not as a flex but as a prayer. But don't get too comfortable, because underneath that stillness, things were shifting. Whispered rebellions, secret romances, women questioning rules, ghosts who didn't like the new incense brand. The calm was cracking, quietly of course, and soon even Silla's perfect silence wouldn't be enough to hold back the noise. But for now, as you lie there, with the hum of the fan and the hush of history settling around you, imagine this, a world where everything important was unspoken, where the most dangerous thing you could do was speak too loudly, or wear a belt outside your rank. And you would have been terrible at it. But that's okay. You don't need to survive Silla, you just need to float through it. Rituals that required you to stop breathing. You're awake again, but only just. That space between dreaming and knowing, where thoughts move like smoke and logic takes a coffee break. That's where Silla lived most comfortably. Because in this world, rituals didn't just demand your presence. They demanded everything else, your breath, your sweat, your posture, and sometimes your common sense. You're standing in the shadow of a temple courtyard, barefoot on sun-warmed stone. A priest is drawing symbols on the ground with powdered bone. Don't ask whose, you don't want to know. Behind him, a line of noblewomen, heads bowed, wait their turn to present offerings. You notice something peculiar. None of them are breathing. Oh, they're alive, technically, but their chests are still, their lips barely parted. It's a kind of sacred stillness, practiced and painful. A discipline called silent breath, a form of spiritual suspension that made you look less earthly. The ancestors apparently preferred their descendants slightly under-oxygenated. Some rituals in Silla required participants to hold their breath for as long as possible while walking across incense-filled rooms or standing before ancestral tablets. The idea? That breath was too alive, too mortal, and should be suppressed in the presence of divine spirits, so as not to overwhelm them with your gross fleshy humanity. Nothing says reverence like nearly passing out, right? Historians still debate whether this practice was widespread or simply reserved for upper-class performances. Some suggest it was part of a larger courtly aesthetic. The quieter, paler, and more ghost-like you appeared, the closer you were to holiness. Others argue it was just another way to filter out the less committed. If you can't hold your breath for 30 seconds without wheezing like a broken flute, maybe you don't deserve to speak to Grandma's ghost. And yes, this is the same society that gave gold crowns to toddlers, but panicked if you sneezed during prayer. This particular ritual, commonly performed during chari, ancestral rites, involved more than just breath holding. Participants also had to arrange food offerings with painful precision. Apples sliced at mathematically perfect angles. Fish steamed with the head facing north-northwest. rice stacked just high enough to suggest generosity but not arrogance. One woman once got scolded for bringing rice that peaked too tall. Her defence: the ancestors were hungry. The priest did not laugh. You, dear traveller, are now kneeling beside a lacquered tray, trying very hard not to exhale. Your lungs are beginning to burn. You think about cheating, maybe a tiny puff through your nose. But no, the spirits will know. They always know. A little boy across the room faints. No one reacts. That's just a Tuesday. The whole ritual lasts 7 minutes, and yet it feels like 7 eternities stacked on top of each other like unlucky Jenga blocks. Finally, a bell rings, one single chime, soft and round like the end of a long sigh. Everyone breathes again. The room fills with quiet coughing. Someone cries. Someone else sneezes and bows immediately in apology. You look up at the altar, half expecting the carved wooden tablets to clap or blink in approval. They don't. But the priest nods. That's as close to a gold star as you'll get. Strangely, these breath rituals weren't limited to religious spaces. Some court events, especially coronations, also involved composure tests, where nobles had to hold specific poses without blinking or breathing too hard, while sacred texts were read aloud. It was performance art, but with more incense and significantly less oxygen. There's even a surviving poem scribbled in the margins of a monk's travel journal that says, "To breathe is to break the spell. Hold your silence, lest the dead grow jealous." Poetic, unsettling, and probably written by someone who passed out and woke up inspired. Some scholars argue that this obsession with stillness was Silla's way of resisting chaos. A world filled with unpredictable weather, fickle kings, and the occasional comet needed control somewhere. And if that control came from micromanaging every muscle in your face, so be it. It's all starting to make sense now, isn't it? The silence, the rituals, the shaved eyebrows, the whispered poems and overcooked fish. It's all part of one enormous, slow-moving ballet of obedience, precision, and very controlled breathing. And you floating here on the edge of sleep have just participated in it. You didn't even need an invitation. All you needed was to be still, to breathe less, to listen. But before we leave tonight's temple, let's take a moment to acknowledge the weirdest thing of all. For many Silla nobles, this was comforting. The rules, the structure, the ritualized starvation of sound and movement. It made the world feel organized, knowable. If you did the rites correctly, shaved the right parts of your body, sliced the right angle of radish, and held your breath for the approved duration, the ancestors would listen, the rice would grow, the dead would rest, and if not, well, let's just say some of them believed that ghosts had long memories and short tempers. As the candles fade and your mind drifts further away, remember this: in Silla, being alive meant pretending, just for a moment, that you weren't, and being respectful meant almost disappearing, which, if you think about it, is pretty close to dreaming. Blade to the brow, ghost at the door. Tonight, the blade returns. It gleams in the lamplight, small, curved, almost delicate. The kind of tool you'd expect to open letters or peel fruit, not carve dignity from a woman's face. But in Silla, this wasn't a beauty instrument. It was a spiritual key, and it was heading straight for your eyebrows. Again. The servant holds the blade with reverence, like it hums with unseen energy. You've done this before. You know what's expected. But your hands still tremble slightly as you lower yourself onto the mat. It's not fear, it's anticipation. Or maybe memory. After all, you've been trained to believe that the slightest error here too slow, too crooked, too vain might offend the watching dead. Because in Silla, the dead are always watching, and they have opinions. The blade touches your skin just above the brow ridge, a single swipe, clean, sharp, almost graceful. You try not to flinch. You think about posture, purity, and the possibility that your great-great-grandmother might be lurking in the rafters, critiquing your technique. Why eyebrows? Why not fingernails or earlobes, or literally anything less visually catastrophic? Historians still argue about it. Some believe eyebrows were seen as spiritual gates, channels of emotion and identity. By removing them, a person surrendered their vanity, their personality, anything that might get in the way of a clean ancestral connection. Others think the act symbolized emptiness, a readiness to receive, like sweeping the altar before laying down an offering, except the altar is your face. And then there's the theory that's both terrifying and weirdly poetic, that shaving the brows was a way to erase the self, to look more like the ancestors already gone. Because the dead, presumably, didn't have eyebrows either. Imagine standing in a room with 20 other women, each one silent, dressed in white, identical in posture, identical in expression, and now identical in absence. No brows, no smirks, no room for individuality. You all look like statues from a temple that got bored of personality. This was not fashion. This was submission. And the ritual wasn't private either. It often happened in public, especially before large ceremonies or funerals. The whole community might gather to witness a line of noblewomen faces scrubbed bare, brows freshly removed, offering incense, bowing slowly, eyes downcast. A performance for both the living and the dead. A double audience, no pressure. Even men weren't entirely exempt. Some court eunuchs and temple attendants were known to shave their eyebrows too, especially before full moon rites or eclipse prayers. In their case, it was less about spiritual purity and more about preventing confusing energies, because apparently too many eyebrows in one room could throw off a ritual. Make it make sense? You can't. It's Silla. One story, probably apocryphal, but deliciously absurd, tells of a queen who insisted that all her handmaidens remain permanently browless as a sign of their loyalty. They complied, of course, except one, a young maid who secretly used crushed charcoal to redraw hers at night. One day the queen walked in unexpectedly. Eyebrowed. Gasps. Scandal. The girl was banished not for disobedience but for vanity. The ghost of the queen's mother might have seen. Yes, that's how seriously they took it. And yet, there's something oddly comforting in all this. The repetition, the rules, the razor-scraping skin not as punishment but as ritual, as prayer. In a world without modern medicine, without reliable weather forecasts, without therapy, sometimes the only thing that made you feel safe was doing something strange in exactly the right way, even if it meant looking like a surprised frog for a few weeks. There's evidence that eyebrow rituals changed over time. Early Silla practices were more seasonal linked to harvest festivals and ancestral birthdays, but by the unified Silla period it had become normalized, institutionalized. The eyebrow blade was as common in a noble home as rice bowls and fans. Some women even passed theirs down as heirlooms, wrapped in silk, handed from mother to daughter with soft warnings like, "Use it only when the spirits are listening." You wonder how often that was. Often enough that in one preserved letter a palace woman wrote, "I dreamt of my grandmother last night. Her face was clear. She said nothing. In the morning I took up the blade. There's no punchline here. Just a quiet moment between generations shared in silence." Maybe you're wondering how people survived this, how they functioned with all this ghostly pressure and facial austerity. The answer is, they didn't think of it that way. To them, it wasn't burden. It was balance. A contract with the unseen. And besides, everyone looked weird together. That always helps. So as you lie there now, drifting in and out of the past, imagine this. A golden palace, filled with incense and quiet footsteps. A courtyard lined with women, faces bare and calm. A ritual older than memory. And one small sharp blade resting on silk waiting to be passed on. Your eyebrows would not have survived. But your spirit? Oh, it might have fit in just fine. Hairstyles that could curse a village. It's morning in the village again, and someone has made a terrible mistake. No, not a crime, not theft, not treason. Worse. They wore the wrong hairstyle on the wrong day. You're not sure who it is yet, but the elders are already whispering. The air tastes tense like oversteeped tea. Birds keep their opinions to themselves. And you just keep your head down, hoping your own braid hasn't accidentally invited spiritual disaster. Because in Silla, hair wasn't just hair. It was language. It was status. It was a communication device, a curse magnet, and sometimes a divine antenna all rolled into one silky high-maintenance mess. The wrong knot at the wrong time, bad harvest, the wrong pin placement on a Tuesday, sudden illness. And if you dared mimic a hairstyle reserved for royalty, you better pray the spirits like dramatic irony. The woman in question, let's call her, had probably meant well. Maybe she saw a court lady visiting the market the day before, admired her beautiful double-coil top knot, and thought, why not me? So she copied it. And now the local shrine keeper is dousing the stone altar with twice the usual incense just in case. Because Hay didn't just wear a royal style, she wore a ritual style, one reserved for mourning, for funerals, for ceremonies so sacred that even the dead sat up to check who was attending. Oops, it sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? To believe that a braid could offend the gods, that a ponytail, tilted just slightly the wrong way, could invite storms or locusts or marital tension. But in Silla, hairstyles weren't a matter of vanity. They were spiritual choreography, and breaking form was like stepping on the wrong floor tile in a temple. Maybe no one notices, or maybe your entire bloodline is cursed for 6 generations. Fun. Officially, there were rules, strict ones. Royal court scrolls laid out approved styles by rank, season, marital status, and even planetary alignment. Widows wore their buns low and loose. Priestesses tied theirs with red ribbon, in the shape of a crescent moon. Young unmarried girls braided their hair with fragrant herbs for luck and fertility. Men, too, had coded styles. Warriors tied their hair back in tight coils, while scholars let theirs hang looser to suggest they had bigger thoughts than knots. And then there were the hairstyles used for ritual communication. Yes, you heard that right. Before certain ceremonies, participants would style their hair in a specific way, tight braids, twisted loops, even shaved patches, to indicate the intention of the rite. Was it for rain? For exorcism? For safe childbirth? The answer was on your scalp. It's like posting your spiritual status update. In hair. Some styles were even designed to ward off specific spirits. The 3-finger crown braid, for instance, was worn during eclipses to confuse celestial demons. They were apparently not very smart and could be deterred by asymmetry. Same, honestly. Historians are still debating whether these rituals were truly believed by all, or whether they were enforced as a way to maintain social control. After all, it's a lot easier to tell who's following the rules if their hair announces it for them. And heaven help you if you didn't follow them. One noble family in the 8th century was struck by an unfortunate series of events: a fire, a miscarriage, and a cow that refused to produce milk. The village priestess diagnosed the cause immediately. The lady of the house had switched her mourning braid too early. Spirits apparently hate time travellers. She redid the braid. The cow gave milk the next morning. Coincidence? Maybe. But would you take the risk? Even hairstyles for the dead had rules. Corpse grooming was a serious responsibility in Silla. Family members would carefully wash and style the deceased's hair before burial, tying it in symbolic knots that indicated who they were in life and where they hoped to go next. You couldn't just bury grandma with bedhead. That would be disrespectful and spiritually dangerous. In one preserved letter, a monk wrote, "The wind has blown the child's braids out of form. We must begin again, lest the spirits lose their way. Hair as map, hair as compass, and hair, of course, as punishment. There are records, vague, cryptic ones, of women being publicly shamed not through violence, but through hair. A noblewoman caught committing adultery might be forced to wear her hair undone and wild in public, a style associated with madness and spiritual contamination. A servant who spilled ink on a scroll might have her bangs sheared unevenly as a reminder that her inner balance had been lost. So much for dry shampoo and forgiveness. It all sounds exhausting. And it was. Maintaining spiritual compliance at follicular level required time, energy, and a remarkable number of hairpins. Some households had full-time attendants just for ritual grooming. Others passed down styling manuals the way we pass down cookbooks. But there was also comfort in it. In a world where your crops could fail, your neighbours could betray you, and your ancestors could decide they didn't like you anymore, there was something reassuring about a good braid. A proper knot. A shape that said, I belong, even if it gave you headaches. So now, as the sun sets over your sleepy thoughts, imagine yourself in a mirror-lit room, hair parted with geometric precision, combed with oils, wrapped and wound in sacred rhythm. Every strand a prayer, every style a sentence in a language the dead can read, and every mistake? Well, maybe it's better not to make one. Painted faces and possessed mirrors. You're standing in front of a mirror again, but this time it's looking back at you. Not in the usual way. This isn't your modern, harmless, foggy bathroom toothpaste-spattered mirror. This one is older, hung lower than eye level, forged in bronze, and polished until its surface is just reflective enough to reveal a blurry version of your face and something else. Something that might not be your face at all. In Silla, mirrors weren't innocent. They weren't decorations. They weren't tools. They were portals, dangerous ones. And cosmetics? They weren't for glamour. They were armour. You dip your fingers into a tiny ceramic pot of powdered cinnabar, the ancient equivalent of blush. You dot it across your cheeks, just as you were taught. 3 taps, clockwise, never before sunrise. Then with a brush made from the tail hair of a fox, you trace a thin line beneath your lower eyelid. Not to highlight your features, but to distract spirits. Yes, distract. Because the belief in Silla was that certain spirits, especially those in limbo, the unsatisfied dead, were drawn to faces. Specifically to unfinished faces. Faces that seemed vulnerable, raw, or improperly painted. So you wore makeup the way a knight wears chainmail layered, deliberate, ritualized. A face half painted was said to invite hauntings. One cheek blushed, one left bare. That's how you wake up with a ghost sitting on your chest, whispering the wrong ancestor's name into your dreams. You think I'm joking, but this was real fear. In fact, court records mention entire days set aside just for makeup preparation before major rituals. Not beauty days, protection days. Women gathered in temple chambers to mix pigments, chant softly, and smear themselves into spiritual decoys. The process could take hours, and you couldn't rush it, because if you did, and something crossed the veil, it might follow you home. And then there were the mirrors. Small, circular, terrifying. Crafted from polished bronze, these mirrors weren't hung on walls to admire oneself. They were placed on altars, buried in graves, and hidden in drawers wrapped in silk or sealed inside wooden boxes. Because sometimes a mirror didn't just reflect your image, it reflected something else too. A popular superstition claimed that if you stared into a mirror too long, especially under moonlight, you might see not your own face, but that of someone who had recently died, and if that happened, you had to immediately smear ash across your eyes and chant a protective verse, or else risk being followed. No one said what followed meant, but the implication was always unpleasant. You're probably wondering why they didn't just stop using mirrors altogether. The answer, of course, is Silla logic, which is to say, the scarier something is, the more sacred it becomes. These mirrors were believed to reveal not just faces, but truths. Deep, uncomfortable truths about fate, illness, or unresolved sins. Some temple monks used them during divinations, gazing into the metal surface until it shimmered with visions. Others avoided them entirely, especially after dark, and yet every noble household owned at least one, not for checking appearances, but for checking alignment. Your face, after all, was part of the spiritual balance. If your blush was too heavy on the right side, it meant a lunar imbalance. If your lips were painted with red clay instead of crushed berries, it might suggest drought. And heaven forbid your eyeliner smudged while a spirit was watching. That was grounds for a purification bath and possibly a week of whispered apologies. One particularly strange practice, recorded in the margins of a medical scroll, describes mirror fasting, a ritual in which a woman would abstain from looking at her reflection for 7 days before a fertility ceremony. The idea was to starve the mirror of identity, so that when she finally looked, her reflection would be fresh enough to fool jealous spirits. Scholars still argue whether this made any difference to fertility rates or sanity, but maybe the strangest cosmetic belief of all, that your face could hold too much beauty, and that was dangerous. A woman whose features were too perfect risked attracting unwanted attention, not from men, from ancestors, and not in the proud, supportive way. In the "I'm going to haunt your tea kettle until you stop looking so smug" kind of way. So some women deliberately flawed their faces. They'd smudge their lip paint, add a freckle on one side, brush soot under one eye to create a spirit gap, a tiny imperfection that would signal humility to the watching dead. Imagine going to a party and thinking, "I better mess up my makeup a little, or a ghost will get jealous and give me foot cramps." Silla was exhausting, but it made sense in its own shimmering way. When the world is unpredictable, when crops can fail and emperors can die and comets can blaze across the sky without warning, then the little things start to matter. The placement of a line, the colour of a cheek, the softness of a glance in the mirror. It's all about control, or the illusion of it. That's why cosmetics in Silla weren't frivolous. They were theology, ephemeral, beautiful, and deeply afraid. Every pot of pigment was a prayer. Every mirror was a risk. And you, soft listener, are now painted for the spirits. Your cheeks are warm, your eyes lined in ancient logic. You step back from the mirror not too quickly, never turn your back on it, and you bow, just in case. The face you wear isn't yours alone tonight. It's shared with your ancestors, your future, and the strange rules of a kingdom that lived quietly, but looked fabulous doing it. Now close your eyes and imagine this. A candle-lit room. 1,000 mirrored faces. Painted women, breathing in unison. A whisper of blush. A shadow of doubt. And one face. Not quite your own. Lingering in the bronze. Sleep well. But maybe don't look in the mirror. Why men dressed like their sisters on holidays. It's festival season in the Silla capital, and the air smells like honeyed rice and unresolved ancestral tension. You're standing in a courtyard surrounded by silk banners and very nervous-looking nobles. Somewhere a drum is beating softly, like a heart that's not sure whether to feel joy or fear. Incense drifts lazily over rooftops. Birds are conspicuously absent, probably avoiding the awkwardness that's about to unfold. And then it happens. The men arrive gliding through the gates, robed in silks, cheeks faintly powdered, brows shaved clean, and hair pinned up in the exact style normally reserved for their sisters. You blink, then blink again. Yep, still happening. Because in Silla, during certain sacred festivals, especially rites of ancestral renewal, men cross-dressed, not as a joke, not as protest, not for performance, but as an offering. The belief that channeling the feminine spirit allowed one to connect more deeply with the ancestors, especially female ancestors. It was an act of empathy, reverence, and probably extreme discomfort for men who had never tried to walk in embroidered shoes with curled toes. But they did it anyway, because in Silla, gender wasn't just a social role, it was a ritual function. And sometimes, honouring the dead meant becoming someone else for the night. preferably someone who knew how to contour. Historians remain divided on just how widespread this practice was. Some argue it was limited to the court elite, a kind of sacred drag reserved for bone-ranked nobility. Others believe it had roots in older shamanistic traditions, where gender fluidity wasn't weird, it was essential. Shamans in early Korean culture often wore mixed gender clothing, speaking in voices that were neither male nor female, but something in between. They were vessels, intermediaries, and Silla borrowed heavily from these beliefs, adding them to its already rich cocktail of rules, rites, and bizarre grooming habits. Which brings us back to today's festival. You're watching a nobleman, let's call him, lord and adjusting the sleeves of his borrowed gown. He's clearly uncomfortable. Not because he looks ridiculous, he doesn't, he actually pulls it off, but because he knows this isn't just about clothing. He's about to dance. Yes, the men dance. In circles, barefoot, around a stone altar covered in fruit, rice cakes, and one very nervous chicken. They move slowly, hands raised, eyes lowered. Their painted faces are serene, but their inner monologues are probably less so. Somewhere, someone's ancestor is hopefully nodding in approval. You might be tempted to laugh, but you'd be missing the point. These men aren't performing for fun, they're bridging a gap. In Silla's worldview, the boundary between worlds, the living and the dead, the male and female, the self and the divine was thin, like rice paper, easily crossed, but only with the right behaviour, the right look, the right ritual. And for men to understand the sorrow of lost mothers, the wisdom of grandmothers, or the warnings of jealous ghost aunties, they had to shed their own forms. Just for a while. You can still see this logic in old paintings and carvings, elegant figures in robes without distinct gender markings, faces so androgynous they could pass for gods or ancestors or both. Identity in these moments wasn't fixed, it was chosen or borrowed. And honestly, there's something kind of beautiful about that. Of course, not everyone embraced the practice. There are records of conservative officials who protested, claiming it dishonoured masculinity or disrupted social order. One famously cranky minister reportedly refused to participate, insisting his ancestors would rather starve than see him in rouge. He died mysteriously 2 months later, probably unrelated. Probably. But most followed the tradition, quietly, grumbling maybe, but dressed and powdered all the same, because Silla was built not on personal preference, but on collective performance. You did what the ritual required, even if it meant threading your hair with peony blossoms while your sister tried not to laugh. And here's where it gets stranger. In some cases, the reverse also happened. There are a few mentions buried in footnotes and whispered in temple records of women taking on masculine roles during harvest rituals, wearing court scholar robes, sitting in the left seat during ancestral offerings, traditionally reserved for male heirs. Some scholars interpret this as spiritual balance, others call it temporary gender inversion. Most agree it was probably stressful for everyone involved, but in a way this made sense. When the dead are your audience and the living are just actors, sometimes you have to rewrite the script. So now, imagine yourself there, in the festival courtyard. The drums rise, the dancers spin, fruit wobbles on golden plates. A man in borrowed earrings smiles uncertainly, his shadow flickering under lantern light. No one laughs, no one mocks. This isn't parody, it's devotion. And as you drift deeper into sleep, consider this. What if identity was a garment you could change for ceremony? What if honouring the past meant temporarily becoming its reflection? And what if your ancestors didn't care about how you looked? Only whether you remembered. The music fades, the robes fall still, and the ancestors, for tonight, are pleased. The night the bone rank collapsed. It starts with a cough. Not the kind from a cold, but the kind someone makes in court when they're about to do something stupidly brave, or bravely stupid. It echoes through the hall like a tiny thunderclap bouncing off silk curtains and golden armour. You turn your head, so does everyone else. There he is, a minor noble, lower bone rank, eyes fixed forward like he's already committed a crime in his mind. And then he does it. He sits, not just anywhere, he sits on the wrong cushion, one intended for someone several ranks higher than him, someone with purer blood, bluer ancestry and possibly a fancier horse. The room freezes, you can hear a hairpin drop. This is not just a seating error, this is blasphemy, because in Silla, where you sat could start a civil war, and why you sat there could end your life. Welcome to the bone rank system, possibly the most elegant and absurd way humanity has ever divided itself. It categorized people based on the purity of their bloodline, not wealth, not intelligence, not skill, just ancestral pedigree. If your great-great-great-grandfather hadn't married the correct cousin, you were out of luck. At the top were the sacred bone and true bone ranks, the royal family and high nobility, whose ancestors allegedly sweat gold and spoke in metaphor. Below them were the head ranks, numbered from 6 down to 1, each with more restrictions than a medieval dating profile. What you wore, what you ate, how high your roof could be, all of it depended on your bone rank. Want to build a house with a tiled roof? Better be at least head rank 5. Want to wear jade jewellery? Sorry, sacred bone only. Want to use a specific shade of blue in your robe? Oops, that's illegal for your DNA. This wasn't just a caste system, it was aesthetic fascism. But tonight, something's cracking. The man who sat in the wrong spot, his name's lost to history. Maybe it was on purpose. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe he just wanted to feel taller. But when he didn't immediately stand up, something shifted in the room. Whispers, tension, and something else. Curiosity. Because people had been tired of counting generations, tired of being told their bloodline made them unfit to own a silver spoon, tired of seeing incompetence in high places just because they shared cheekbones with someone famous. The bone rank had been cracking for years, they just didn't know it yet. And now, a man just sat where he wasn't supposed to, and no one stopped him, not immediately anyway. Historians argue about when the bone rank truly lost its grip. Some say it happened gradually eroded by the rise of a bureaucratic class that cared more about literacy than lineage. Others say it snapped in one glorious moment of collective eyebrow raising and rule breaking. The truth is probably somewhere in between. By the late Silla period, commoners had begun to gain power, not because the system allowed it, but because reality forced it. Wars required capable generals, not just well-born ones. Agriculture needed experts, not just titles. And when your harvest depended on getting help from someone ranked below you, suddenly bone purity didn't feel so urgent. But it wasn't just politics, it was personal. One court document records a noblewoman true bone rank who was caught eloping with a head rank 4 scholar. Scandal. Her family threatened exile. The spirits were probably consulted, but instead of apologizing, she wrote a poem. A poem. It read, "If blood determines love, let mine spill freely. If rank defines my heart, then it beats out of order." Iconic behaviour. Eventually, the bone rank system became so convoluted that even the royal court struggled to enforce it. There were too many exceptions, too many marriages between the wrong ranks, too many unrecorded ancestors who might have been noble, if only they'd written things down. And as society evolved, the old rules began to feel less sacred, more annoying. One official reportedly tried to enforce bone rank seating at a royal feast, only to be shouted down by a younger noble who said, and I quote, "Then let the dead eat first, since they care more than we do." Burn. Some temples even began ignoring bone rank entirely. Priests took students based on merit, not family tree. A few radical monasteries went so far as to shave everyone's heads and declare them rankless, a spiritual reset button. No brows, no braids, no bone. just monks and ghosts figuring things out. But the collapse wasn't clean. There were holdouts. Old families clinging to their sacred ancestry like a badly aging celebrity, refusing to give up the stage. Some tried to revive the rank codes. Some tried to invent new ones. A few even claimed spiritual visions in which the ancestors demanded the restoration of sacred seating charts. Those visions were not widely believed. Eventually the bone rank system faded, not because it was dismantled, but because no one could be bothered to maintain it. Like a once grand palace left to moss and pigeons, the title stayed for a while, out of habit, but the meaning dissolved. And yet, the ghost of it lingers, in the way people still care too much about family names, in the way some rooms are still divided by invisible lines of legacy, in the way you sometimes wonder if you belong, not because of who you are, but because of who you weren't born to. Even now, centuries later, you can feel the hum of that old system, that need to sort, to rank, to sit on the correct cushion. But tonight, you don't need any of that. You've wandered through gold and incense, shaved brows and spirit mirrors, and now you know better. You belong where you choose to rest. So go ahead. Take the nice cushion, even if it was meant for someone sacred. Royal ghosts and eyeliner that glowed the tomb is quiet but not still. You're walking barefoot along its outer edge, the soles of your feet brushing against chilled stone and buried memory. It doesn't feel like death here. It feels like waiting. Because this isn't just any tomb, it's royal. It hums with the energy of someone who was once very powerful, very fashionable, and very unwilling to leave quietly. A Silla queen lies beneath your steps, and she took her makeup with her. Buried beside her, gold, jade, silk, perfumes, a few scrolls, and at least 3 full cosmetic kits. Powdered pigments in carved seashells, brushes made from animal hair, tiny jars sealed with beeswax. One of them, if legend is true, still glows faintly in the dark. Because apparently, even in the afterlife, she planned to keep her eyeliner game sharp. This wasn't unusual. The Silla elite buried their dead with beauty supplies, not to impress mourners, but to maintain their spiritual image. A clean face, painted with the proper rituals, was believed to protect against decay, not just physical, but cosmic. As if the universe judged you on your cheek contour. And maybe it did. Silla was full of strange contradictions. A kingdom obsessed with silence, but buried its royals like celebrities. A society that erased eyebrows out of humility, but gilded its dead with enough gold to light up an eclipse. But the cosmetics buried in these tombs tell another story. One of belief, power, and a deep, gnawing fear of being forgotten. One tomb, possibly that of Queen Seondok, though scholars still debate, contained a polished bronze mirror so large it required 2 attendants to carry. On its underside, a poem etched so finely you could only read it in sunlight. It reads, "When my name fades, let the light from my lashes mark my return." That doesn't sound like a queen planning to stay dead. And in truth, she didn't. There are stories, quiet ones, written in monastic margins and gossiped among herbalists, of a woman in royal robes appearing by moonlight. Her face pale and painted, her gaze heavy with kohl. She doesn't speak, just watches, then vanishes. Some say she visits to check that her makeup is still being worn correctly. Others say she's looking for her mirror, the pigment that glowed, likely made from ground mica or crushed fireflies, a practice used sparingly because it required, well, crushed fireflies. But in death that wasn't a concern. You weren't bound by moral squeamishness. You were bound by memory. Glowing pigment wasn't just for glamour, it was a signal, a way for the dead to be seen in the dark, to ensure that in the inky blackness of the tomb their beauty and by extension their identity remained intact. Some tombs were built with tiny skylights, not for air, for moonlight, so that once a month, when the moon passed overhead, A narrow beam would hit the face of the deceased and shimmer faintly on their cosmetics. Can you imagine? Lying in eternal rest, painted and perfect, waiting for that one sacred second of lunar spotlight. Theatrical? Absolutely. But also deeply human. Because if death is the final stage, then of course you want good lighting. There's even a recorded case of a noblewoman who was buried with 4 different makeup kits each, designated for a season. Her tomb inscription reads, "Spring for the cheeks, summer for the lips, autumn for the eyes, winter for the soul." Her descendants supposedly held ceremonies to refresh her look with the changing seasons, opening the tomb just enough to leave updated cosmetics inside. Whether the Queen ever used them is unclear. Whether anyone dared test her ghost's taste? Definitely not. Academics still debate whether this was sincere belief or just elaborate burial customs. Was it religion, ritual, or just really committed self-care? One camp argues that these tomb cosmetics were symbolic tools to guide the dead through the afterlife, like maps etched onto skin. Another insists they were offerings to deities, or even to the tomb spirits themselves, tiny bribes with blush. But a few radical scholars, my favourites, suggest something stranger. They believe the queens of Silla expected to return, that they weren't preparing for death, but staging an intermission. Their makeup was not goodbye, it was a contingency plan. Because power doesn't disappear, it changes outfits. So now, as you drift closer to sleep, picture yourself walking through one of those great tombs. The air is heavy with perfume aged 1,000 years. The walls glow faintly with mineral dust. You look down and see footprints, fresh ones, just ahead of you. The Queen has visitors tonight. Maybe she never left. Maybe she's just reapplying. So sleep softly, dear one. And if you feel someone watching from the mirror, compliment their eyeliner. It's probably earned. Wives who disappeared into paper walls. It begins with footsteps. Soft ones. The kind you don't notice until they've already stopped. They vanish behind a sliding door, thin, translucent, made from paper and pine. You follow, but when you slide it open, there's nothing there. Just a room, neat, silent, and empty, except for the faint scent of sandalwood and the lingering warmth of someone who was just here. In Silla, women disappeared all the time. Not in the way of murder mysteries or true crime podcasts. No blood, no chase. Just quiet, practiced exits. One moment they were wives, daughters, concubines. The next, they were shadows behind paper doors. Gone, without going far. These weren't kidnappings or exiles. They were rituals. Women were pulled into silence by something older than law, stronger than marriage. Something sacred, something strange. They went into monasteries, or ritual seclusion, or simply behind a particular screen and never came back out the same way. In Silla, the concept of ritual withdrawal was well documented and barely understood. The most famous case? A high-ranking noblewoman, Lady Valois, whose husband died unexpectedly during the rainy season. She completed the required morning rites, white robes, fasting, ancestral offerings. But then, instead of rejoining court life, she walked into her private room, shut the paper screen behind her, and never stepped out. Again. Servants delivered food to a low shelf just inside the door. No one saw her for 24 years. When they finally entered the room, it was empty. Just a single note scrawled on silk. I heard the dead whisper. I chose to stay in the pause between. Her disappearance became legend, and not a unique one. Records tell of similar stories, women who, after a loss or vision or dream, chose to become ritual ghosts. They didn't die. They didn't leave. They simply withdrew into rooms, temples, or veils of incense and dissolved into memory. Some called it madness. Others called it sainthood. The term used was hua iome, kind of sacred silence, a vow not of speechlessness but of non-participation. To remove oneself from the noise of life so that the dead could speak more clearly through you. Of course, this wasn't offered to everyone. To disappear properly in Silla You needed status, servants, and a family willing to let you stop existing on paper while still feeding you rice and respect. Commoners tried it too, but their disappearances were usually shorter and less poetic. One folktale tells of a farm girl who hid behind a barn curtain for a week, claiming she was listening to her grandmother's ghost. Her brother finally dragged her out, muttering about chores and spiritual inflation. But the noble cases, those carried weight, and sometimes power. Because not all these women stayed gone. Some emerged years later with strange authority. One noble widow vanished after her child died during an eclipse. 10 years later, she returned wearing black, carrying a scroll of poetry, and claiming to have received instructions from the spirit world. No one dared question her. She moved through court like a living omen. Her advice was followed. Her presence inspired unease and awe. Some whispered she wasn't fully alive anymore. Others said she was simply what grief looks like when it hardens into religion. And here's the eerie part. Many of these withdrawn women were consulted. Monarchs sent envoys to knock gently on paper walls and request spiritual insights from the figures within. Ask her what the comet means. Ask her if the child is cursed. Ask her if we are still favoured by the ancestors. The answers came back in ink and silence, always cryptic, always poetic, often correct. Some historians suggest these women were early mystics, self-appointed oracles who found power in powerlessness. Others think they were just traumatized, escaping unbearable realities into socially acceptable disappearance. But the truth, as always with Silla, is layered. It was part grief, part ritual, part political performance. To remove oneself was an act of surrender and a form of control. The world couldn't touch you, but you could reach through the paper and still change it. And of course, the paper walls weren't always literal. Sometimes, a woman disappeared without ever leaving. She simply stopped speaking, or stopped looking people in the eye, or refused to walk in sunlight. One court lady wore a veil for 30 years. Not for modesty, but because she believed her dead sister's spirit had taken residence in her left eye, and the light would disturb it. Again, deeply inconvenient. Also, deeply respected. Because in a society obsessed with appearances, with ranks and rituals and reflections, the ultimate rebellion was to become invisible, to retreat so fully into ritual that you no longer needed a face. So now, as you sink deeper into your pillow and the edges of the world grow soft, imagine this. A woman seated behind a paper screen, a brush in her hand, a bowl of cooled tea beside her. She hasn't spoken in 10 years, but she hears everything. Outside, someone whispers her name. She doesn't answer, but she smiles. Because in Silla, vanishing wasn't always loss. Sometimes it was transformation. Dancing in the shadow of the comet. It begins, not with a bang but with a streak. A long, slow scar drawn across the night sky. Pale fire trailing through darkness, not falling, not rising, just moving, sideways, like a mistake the heavens are trying to erase. In Silla, comets weren't just cosmic graffiti. They were warnings, letters from the ancestors, bad omens written in flame and read by terrified astronomers with no backup plan. And the one that passed overhead in the 9th century, that one made everyone shave their heads. Let me explain. You're outside the palace gates on a humid summer night. The heat has pressed the crickets into silence, and the stars are so bright they look aggressive. Everyone is already on edge. The king's been ill, the harvest has been weirdly early, and someone found a chicken egg with 2 yolks last week, which always means trouble. Then the comet comes. It doesn't roar, it doesn't flash, it just appears, hovering silently across the sky, as if it's watching, judging, taking notes. And that's when the panic begins. Within hours, the court astrologers are summoned. These are not chill people. They're sweating into their scrolls, muttering calculations and trying very hard to pretend they didn't just scream when the tail of the comet pointed directly at the Royal Observatory. They present their findings the next morning in the form of a poem, because of course they do. A tale across the sky, a sickness in the bone. If heads remain unshaved, the earth will crack its spine. Yikes! And so begins one of the most quietly chaotic weeks in Silla history, the comet purification ritual. First order of business? Hair removal, not just eyebrows this time. Heads, nobles, monks, servants. Everyone with a spiritual title or even a mild spiritual hobby is required to shave their head as a sign of humility. The logic: if the gods mistake you for a priest, maybe they'll skip punishing you. This includes the women of the court, who up until now have fiercely guarded their elaborate ceremonial hairstyles. Those towering braids, those golden pins, those intricate coils, they all hit the floor with a collective thump of existential dread. And it doesn't stop there. Next comes the noise. For 7 nights, villagers and city dwellers alike are ordered to participate in ritual disorientation. This means banging pots, shouting into wells, and most importantly, dancing. Yes, dancing. The theory was that spirits and celestial forces could be confused by erratic human movement. If your body was unpredictable enough, maybe fate couldn't find you, so people dance. Everywhere. In courtyards, rice fields, temple steps. Awkward, desperate movements, as if trying to physically dodge karma. One noblewoman, according to her journal, describes the experience like this: I danced until my shadow forgot me. I danced until the comet blinked. I danced with no music, and still, I feared I moved too gracefully. She wasn't alone. Entire towns perform these wild dances, staggering, spinning, sometimes laughing, sometimes weeping, not as celebration, but as defense, because no one really knew what the comet wanted. But no one wanted to be the one who didn't dance. Meanwhile, back at the palace, things were getting weirder. The king reportedly refused to eat solid food for the duration of the comet's visibility. Instead, he consumed only liquid soups, teas, broths, as a symbolic act of becoming formless. The idea was that if the comet sought a target, it wouldn't recognize a man who had no edges. He also instructed his ministers to speak only in questions for 3 days. That lasted half a day before everyone got annoyed. Is this truly necessary, Your Majesty? Why don't you tell me? Is this what governing looks like now? Perhaps. Historians are still debating whether this was sincere ritual or royal performance art. Some argue the whole comet panic was orchestrated by the priesthood to regain influence. Others point out that similar comet responses happened in neighbouring kingdoms, and sometimes involved burning entire libraries. So maybe Silla's dance party wasn't the worst option. Still, the week left its mark. Hair lost, rituals rewritten. Some families never regrew their old hairstyles again. One courtier insisted on remaining bald for the rest of her life, claiming she'd never felt so spiritually aerodynamic. Poems written during this time reveal a strange mix of terror and beauty. One of the more haunting ones reads, "A fire in the sky, a silence in the bones. I danced like a prayer that forgot its God. So now, as you lie there under your own night sky cometless, for now imagine this, a city under starlight, full of shaved heads and flailing limbs, a kingdom trying to confuse the heavens into mercy, a people who danced, not for joy, but for survival. And maybe it worked, because the comet passed, and the earth did not crack its spine. So sleep easy tonight. No dancing required, just breathing, and maybe a tiny prayer of thanks to the people who danced for you first." Monks, who collected eyebrows in jars. It starts, as many Silla oddities do, in a temple. You're inside a quiet chamber, lit only by sunlight diffused through paper windows. The walls are bare. The floor creaks softly beneath your knees. In the centre of the room sits a monk bald, ancient, serene, and behind him, a shelf lined with Jars. Lots of jars. Neatly arranged. Carefully labelled. Each one containing, yes, you guessed it, eyebrow hairs. You blink. Twice. Still there. Welcome to one of Silla's most obscure spiritual practices, brow harvesting. According to temple records and a few deeply unsettling poems, certain Buddhist sects believed that eyebrow hairs retained karmic weight, that the smallest strand if removed during a sacred ritual carried traces of your spiritual effort, your emotional state, and sometimes your future reincarnation. So monks collected them, not randomly, not like creepy hoarders, but with precision, only during ritual shaving, only with consent, and only if the hair came from someone in a heightened spiritual state, mourning, fasting, meditating, or preparing for ancestral contact. The collected brows were stored in glass or ceramic jars sealed with wax and placed on high shelves in temple libraries. Think of it as a spiritual archive. Instead of scrolls or relics, they archived forehead fragments. Some jars had inscriptions, others had dates. One was labelled, from Lady Jion, Year of the Water Horse. She wept while offering incense. Romantic. Kind of. Creepy. Absolutely. But strangely, it wasn't just a record of suffering. It was seen as an act of devotion. Giving your eyebrow during a spiritual moment was like offering a piece of your soul, a sliver, a whisper. The idea was that one day, in some reincarnated form, that strand might help reconnect your spirit to its previous journey. Historians naturally argue about this. Some say the jars were purely symbolic, metaphors, like keeping prayer beads or sand from a pilgrimage. Others suggest the monks genuinely believed the brows held spiritual charge, not power, but memory. A few fringe scholars even claim some jars were used in ritual diagnosis, that monks would meditate near them to detect spiritual imbalance in the community. One journal entry by a temple scribe says, "The jar from the midwinter shaving hummed last night. A death is coming." Sure, okay. Even in Silla, not everyone bought into it. There were skeptics, of course. One grumpy court official called the practice follicular folly and accused the monks of being closet hair fetishists with a philosophy problem. He was quickly reassigned to latrine maintenance for spiritual slander. What's more, eyebrow collection was often secretive. The public knew it happened, but they didn't talk about it. Like your uncle's weird hobbies or that one room in grandma's house you weren't allowed to open. Some women actually kept their shaved brows and buried them privately, afraid that if a monk got hold of them, their karma might be read. And yes, that's a thing too. One temple text describes a meditation practice in which monks would select a single brow hair, hold it between the fingers, and focus on its length, curl and hue to sense the moment of its release. Through that moment, they believed the emotional state of the person could be intuited. Joy, a soft curve. Grief, a brittle texture. Doubt, a split end. Can you imagine being judged across lifetimes by your split ends? But in Silla, nothing was too small to matter. The world was built on whispers, and a whisper, in the form of a hair, could become a prayer. There are even stories of brow jars being passed down through generations. A great-granddaughter would return to the same temple decades later and ask to see her ancestor's jar. Monks would retrieve it, still sealed, still labelled. Sometimes they'd place it on an altar during family rituals. One strand connecting lifetimes. It's absurd. It's beautiful. It's exactly the kind of thing a kingdom like Silla would do. Because in a society where silence is sacred, gold is buried, and eyebrows are messages, the idea that a single hair could matter makes perfect sense. Now, as you drift close to sleep, imagine this. A jar, small and round, resting on a wooden shelf. Inside, a curl of something nearly invisible. Labelled, honoured, remembered. Somewhere in the dark, a monk sits quietly beside it, listening. Not for sound, but for presence. Because sometimes devotion isn't loud. Sometimes it's just a hair in a jar and the silence around it. Silla's beauty contests were secret rituals. You're in the garden of a palace tonight, but it doesn't feel like a garden. It feels like a stage. Lanterns sway gently from silk cords above you, casting ripples of golden light over carefully combed grass. Blossoms float in shallow ponds, as if nature itself has been told to behave, to look nice. And all around, people are watching, politely, silently, a little too intently. Because something is about to begin. A procession. No, a competition. Wait, actually, it's neither. It's something stranger. Welcome to Silla's secret beauty rituals events that, on the surface, look like gentle pageants. But in truth, they were tests, not of looks, but of spirit, poise, and the ability to carry fruit without accidentally summoning a ghost. Let me explain. The event was called Guanhua, a seasonal gathering of young women from noble families, presented before a council of elders, monks, and the occasional suspicious shaman. The public thought it was a celebration of grace and decorum. In theory, these girls were being assessed for court positions, marriages, or temple roles. In reality, it was a screening for spiritual sensitivity. Think of it like an audition for ghost whispering, with better outfits. Participants were judged not just on posture, etiquette, or how gracefully they bowed. Those were table stakes. The real scoring happened in a private. After the garden procession, each girl was led into a small chamber one by one. Inside, a low table, a mirror, a candle, and 3 bowls each covered with silk. Their task? Simple. Choose one. Each bowl contained something: different ashes, rice, or salt water. Unlabeled. If the girl chose correctly, the candle would flicker. If she chose poorly, it would go out entirely. That was the visible part. The invisible part? The room, according to temple law, was consecrated, a space where ancestral energy was said to linger. Some claimed a priestess would sit behind a paper screen, watching through a pinhole, waiting for the tiniest signs of fear, pride, or spiritual tilt. Others believed the test wasn't about the bowls at all, but how the girls looked when they thought no one was watching. Were their faces composed? Did they adjust their makeup? Did their eyebrows twitch at the wrong moment? These were the real questions. You see, in Silla, beauty was never just beauty. It was evidence. A well-painted face suggested a well-regulated soul, and certain expressions, arched brows, pursed lips, tilted eyes, were thought to reveal your karmic history. Smiling too easily, you were either lucky or hiding something. Frowning at incense, you might attract the wrong kind of ghost. One woman reportedly scored perfectly in her Guanhua evaluation, without ever speaking a word. The judges later claimed that her silence sang like a prayer. Another, more awkward candidate giggled during her mirror test and was immediately disqualified, not because she laughed, but because she didn't bow to her own reflection first. That's right. You had to bow to your own face, because your face wasn't yours alone. It was part of the ancestral continuum, a blend of every mother, aunt, and grandmother who came before you. Looking in a mirror was considered an act of respect, or, if done carelessly, an act of vanity punishable by mild haunting. Some participants were selected, not for roles in court, but for roles in ritual drama. A rare and almost mystical performance art in which women reenacted historical or mythological stories in front of shrine audiences. Their movements were slow, deliberate, and symbolic. Each gesture matched to a cosmic element. 1 hand lift equals rising moon. 2 steps forward equals ancestral memory. Head tilt plus downward gaze equals confession of forgotten grief. It was choreography at the edge of the spiritual realm, and it was exhausting. Some girls fainted during rehearsals, others went home with headaches, insisting that their dreams were now too loud. Just a few left the capital entirely and disappeared into rural temples, claiming they'd seen something behind the mirror during the bowl test. No one asked them to explain, because no one wanted to know. The Guanhua event was held only once a year, timed to the moment when lotus flowers bloomed and the stars of the Ghost Path constellation aligned. The rituals were cloaked in language about virtue, femininity and spiritual refinement. But everyone knew what it really was, a game of hide and seek with the dead. And beauty, that was just the bait. Painted cheeks, shaved brows, silken robes. The girls looked like ornaments, but they were being studied like omens. A diary entry from a court attendant reads, "The girl in green stepped wrong during the third bowl. Her shadow lingered longer than her body." I said nothing. I bowed. Spooky. There's little record of what happened to the women selected for ritual performance. Some married well, others vanished into temple archives, transcribing scriptures no one was allowed to read. One became a spirit medium, reportedly able to speak with the dead using only facial gestures. Whether that was true or just a very dramatic way to get out of awkward conversations, no one could say. But the ritual endured, year after year, even as empires shifted and new kings rose with new laws and looser eyebrows. The Guanhua persisted in some quiet corners, a last gasp of the old Silla order, a place where beauty was ritual, silence was language, and mirrors were not to be trusted. So now, as you settle into the darkness of your own room, imagine this. A line of young women in pale robes, a garden humming with incense, a bowl of salt water trembling just slightly, and a single candle flickering, as if it knows something you don't. You're not being judged tonight, but someone, somewhere, is. Sleep softly, and maybe bow to your reflection, just in case. When the moon demanded a human haircut. Tonight, the moon is unusually close. Not just visibly close, but emotionally needy. It hangs in the sky like a forgotten cousin who suddenly wants to reconnect after centuries of ghosting, pun intended. And it's not here for polite small talk. It's here for hair. You're sitting outside a village near Gyeongju watching as a group of people quietly gather in the field. It's a full moon night, but not just any full moon. It's the month of the severed light, a rare lunar event recorded only a few times in Silla's 1,000-year history. No one knows what causes it, but every time it happens, things get weird. Babies refuse to sleep. Dogs howl with better pitch than court musicians, and most notably, people start cutting their hair. Voluntarily, compulsively, ritually. Because in Silla, when the moon glowed too bright, it was believed to be watching too closely. And when the moon watched too closely, it could steal things. Luck, memory, sleep, and for some reason, hair. The only defense, offer it first. A little snip, a little bow, a little muttered apology for your uneven part. That was the ritual. Tonight you watch as one by one, villagers walk to the centre of the field and hand a priestess a lock of their hair. Not much, just enough to count. Each strand wrapped in silk, kissed with incense, and tucked into a lacquered box sealed with wax and moon water. No talking, no crying, just a quiet submission to cosmic grooming. This wasn't superstition, it was tradition. Ancient, solemn, and according to the elderly woman beside you, mandatory. She tells you, in a whisper like wind through reeds. Last time someone skipped it, he lost his eyebrows in his sleep. Woke up bald from the eyes up. Took it as a sign, became a monk. Makes sense. The moon was a fickle guest in Silla's belief system. Sometimes a goddess, sometimes a mirror, sometimes a floating judge who could ruin your rice harvest with a sideways glare. Lunar eclipses were especially alarming interpreted as moments when the moon got angry or shy, depending on how red it turned. One monk's journal describes a night when the moon turned blood orange, and an entire village shaved their heads and lay flat on the ground, chanting lullabies until it calmed down. That's devotion, or fear, or both. But the month of the severed light was different. It wasn't an eclipse. It was a full moon, so clear, so piercing. that it was said to see into your thoughts. People reported dreams of glowing eyes, of being chased by silver-haired women with scissors, of seeing themselves from above-moon vision, they called it. So, obviously, you cut your hair. You offered a piece of yourself, hoping the moon would be satisfied and leave the rest of you alone. Court records show that even nobles participated. Empresses snipping ceremonial strands from under their wigs, royal guards offering slivers of their moustaches with heavy reluctance. One scholar reportedly cried for 3 hours after parting with a particularly poetic sideburn. Some temples held moon appeasement ceremonies, elaborate rituals involving water bowls, floating candles, and synchronized hair trimming while reciting lunar poems backward. Why backward? Because the moon already saw everything forward. Backward was apparently harder to decode. One such poem survives in the temple archives. It reads, "Cut from the root of thought, cast into the bowl of silver night. Let no strand remain unoffered, lest the watcher take more than hair. Dramatic, effective, and eerily beautiful." There's even a theory among modern scholars that the tradition may have had a practical origin, that perhaps the luminous full moon revealed lice infestations, leading to spontaneous hygiene practices conveniently wrapped in divine metaphor. But we're not here for that version. We're here for the one where the moon demands tribute, and people obey because the consequences of not obeying are simply too strange to test. There's one story half folk tale, half-court gossip of a noblewoman who refused the lunar haircut ritual. She claimed her hair was too beautiful, too sacred, too meticulously oiled to be trifled with. That night, her reflection disappeared from her mirror. She was seen wandering the palace at dawn, calling out for herself. No one ever found the missing image. But the next full moon, she shaved her head completely, and the reflection returned. Coincidence? Probably. But again, would you take that risk? Now, back in the field, you notice something. After the hair is offered, after the final bow, the priestess lights a small flame in the centre of the box. Just enough to singe the hair, not burn it entirely, just scorch it lightly. A kiss of fire to seal the pact. The smell is sharp, not unpleasant, ancient. The offering is complete. The moon, at last, begins to climb down from its throne. It looks pleased, or maybe just bored. You feel a cool breeze run over your scalp, playful, precise. You check your hair, still there. You must have passed the test. So now, as you sink into your pillow, think of this. A moon with a memory, a field full of offerings, a lock of hair given freely, and a sky that watches, quietly satisfied. Maybe the stars keep secrets. Maybe the moon keeps souvenirs. Sleep softly and keep your scissors close, just in case. The princess who painted her dreams on her face. You're sitting in a palace chamber late at night. The windows are shut, the lanterns are low, and the air smells faintly of ink and plum wine. And across from you sits a princess. She doesn't speak. She doesn't have to. Her face is already telling the story. Because tonight she's wearing her dreams. Not the kind you describe over tea the next morning. Not vague symbols or strange floating doors. Number. These are painted, carefully, deliberately, in layers of ritual makeup that no one else in the court quite understands. Her name, in the records, is Princess Sariong, though her story has been scratched out and rewritten so many times, it's hard to say which version is true. Some call her a mystic, others a rebel. A few just called her that girl with the weird eyeliner. But what everyone agrees on is this: she never repeated a look. Each morning, she appeared at court with a different face. Not hidden, just remixed. One day she drew a red spiral on her cheek, which she claimed represented the dream she had had of time reversing itself. Another day she lined only one eye and powdered her lips blue. When asked why, she whispered, "I saw myself speaking to the dead." I wanted them to recognize me. Fashion statement? Possibly. Mental breakdown? Also possible. But in Silla, where the line between ritual and rebellion was as thin as a paper screen, she made a new category, cosmetic prophecy. She believed, truly believed, that her dreams weren't just subconscious chaos. They were messages, instructions, warnings, and that by painting them onto her face she could share them, protect others, or occasionally frighten them just enough to change the outcome. Her makeup became her language. No scrolls, no sermons, just hush. At first, the court tolerated it. Royal daughters were allowed eccentricities, especially if they came wrapped in incense and poetry. But soon, her cosmetics started drawing attention. One day, she showed up to a ceremony with her brows drawn not above her eyes, but in the centre of her forehead, like a third eye. She claimed she'd dreamt of a fire, and the brow placement was meant to see through it. That night, a fire broke out in the kitchen wing. Coincidence? The cooks didn't think so. They bowed extra low the next morning. Another day she arrived with streaks of silver powder fanned across her jaw. "I dreamt of the moon weeping," she said. "This is where it landed." No one asked what it was. Eventually people began watching her more carefully, not with suspicion, with reverence. If her face was different, they assumed the day would be too. If her lips were pale, they wore extra charms. If her cheeks were bare, they walked more quietly. She had become a walking forecast. But not everyone liked it. Some ministers began to complain. They argued that her expressions disrupted court rituals, that her face, while lovely, made others uncomfortable. One even accused her of cosmetic heresy. That's not a joke. That's an actual charge. Because in Silla, makeup wasn't just paint. It was ritual correctness. To use it wrong or invent your own meanings was to risk throwing off the spiritual balance of the entire royal household. If her eyeliner said grief, but the calendar said joy, the gods might get confused, or worse, offended. A secret tribunal was held to discuss whether she should be retrained. The court poet, who had a soft spot for the princess, defended her in a letter. "If we do not allow dreams on the face, then we doom them to rot in the chest. Powerful, but ineffective." Eventually, they issued a quiet order. The princess could no longer attend court functions unless she wore approved makeup patterns. 3 styles were offered. She declined them all. Instead, she vanished. Not dramatically, not permanently, just gradually. She stopped appearing in public, stopped attending feasts. Her face, once a daily oracle, became a memory, then a rumour. It was said she continued to paint in private, that her attendants were forbidden to speak of her new designs, that her chamber walls were covered in cosmetic sketches drawn with trembling hands and lotus ink. One maid, years later, confessed in a temple that she once saw the princess's face at midnight and wept. When asked why, she simply said, "Because I understood it." No one knew what that meant. No one asked again. And then years later, her final appearance. The princess emerged during a festival honouring ancestral spirits. She walked slowly into the temple courtyard, wearing white robes and no shoes, but her face, it was covered in tiny symbols barely visible, drawn in ash and oil. Not decorative, not even symmetrical, just meaningful, or meant to be. One mark under her eye looked like a bird. Another at her chin resembled a closed door. Her lips were untouched. She knelt before the altar, placed a small mirror on the stone and said, "Let the dead read." Then she left and never appeared again. Some say she died in a dream. Others believe she became a spirit medium, her face painted now only by visions. A few monks claim she reincarnated as a calligrapher whose work made people weep without understanding why. Whatever happened, her story lived on in art, in ritual, and in the margins of forgotten scrolls. And in one particular temple, every year, On the anniversary of that final appearance, the priestesses paint their faces, not for beauty, not for tradition, but for communication. They paint birds, doors, moons, fire, and they sit in silence in front of a mirror, waiting to be understood. So now, as you drift into the quiet space between dream and sleep, imagine this: a room lit by moonlight, a brush dipped in black ink, a face becoming a message, and eyes not watching you, but waiting for you to see. Tonight your dreams might say something too. Maybe tomorrow morning you'll paint them. And maybe, just maybe, someone will understand. Eunuchs who guarded the mirror rooms. The corridor is long, narrow, and a little too quiet. You're not sure how you got here. One moment you were drifting through a memory of plum blossoms, the next you were inside the inner sanctum of the Silla palace, where only the most trusted were allowed to walk, and in front of you stands a door, plain, wooden, unadorned except for one thing, a bronze plate shaped like an open eye. Behind this door lies one of Silla's strangest chambers, the mirror room, and standing beside the door, utterly still, is a eunuch. He doesn't speak, he doesn't move, but you just know that he sees everything. You step closer, and for a moment you catch your own reflection in the eye-shaped bronze. You're not sure it looks like you. The face seems stretched, older, or perhaps younger, with a tiredness that doesn't belong to you, or doesn't belong to you yet. And the eunuch finally speaks, softly. Are you ready to be watched? The mirror rooms of Silla were real, or at least real enough that multiple records mention them in tones of reverent dread. Hidden deep within royal complexes and certain temples, these rooms were spaces of reflection, both literal and metaphysical. Inside were dozens of bronze mirrors, polished to a gleaming blur, arranged at various heights and angles. Their purpose? That depends who you ask. To some, they were tools of confession. To others, spiritual amplifiers. And to a few, doorways. But the one thing everyone agrees on, they were always guarded by eunuchs. Not just any eunuchs. These were trained specialists, chosen for their absolute loyalty, their silence, and their unusual capacity to resist the pull of the mirrors. Because the mirrors didn't just reflect your face, they reflected possibility. Legend says the mirrors were forged during a lunar eclipse, using bronze smelted with powdered jade and the ashes of sacred scrolls. Probably exaggerated. But when you stood in one, really stood there, eyes fixed on your reflection, it was said you could see echoes of your past, of someone else's future, of what you might have been if things had gone slightly differently. For most people, this was unsettling at best, destabilizing at worst. Hence, the eunuchs. Their job wasn't just to guard, it was to anchor. If a noblewoman lost herself in the mirror, stood staring too long, went pale, began to speak in voices that weren't hers, it was the eunuch's role to gently intervene, with incense, with prayer, sometimes with cold water, sometimes it didn't work. There are stories, softly spoken, written in margins and whispered among temple servants, of a scholar who entered the mirror room seeking clarity, only to leave with no memory of his own name, of a court dancer who visited after her mother's death and returned convinced she had become her mother's ghost, of a young prince who smashed a mirror after claiming he saw the war that hadn't happened yet. Each of these incidents was documented, each followed by quiet reassignment of the eunuchs on duty. One journal believed to belong to a senior eunuch contains this passage. We do not look directly, we watch the watchers. When their pupils widen, we count. 3 heartbeats. If they do not blink by then, we close the mirror. The eunuchs were trained in more than spiritual safeguarding. They knew how to read micro-expressions, how to sense when a person was beginning to detach from themselves, when memory was fragmenting, or when too much truth had been seen too fast. Because the mirrors didn't lie. But they didn't comfort either. They showed you what you didn't ask for, which frankly sounds like a terrible way to spend your evening. Some historians believe the mirror rooms were used during royal decisions, that high-ranking nobles would spend time inside before key moments, treaty signings, executions, coronations, not to consult spirits, but to confront their own reflection, their legacy, their doubt, and always a eunuch waited outside, listening, never judging, always prepared to intervene. One eunuch reportedly served the same mirror for 40 years. He never looked into it directly, not once. At his retirement, the court poet asked what he believed lay within it. He replied, "Whatever you hide best, cryptic, terrifying, on brand." Of course, not all mirrors in Silla were like this. Most were decorative, portable, mundane. But the mirror rooms were different. Sacred, dangerous, often locked for decades between uses. Some say they were eventually dismantled, not because people stopped believing, but because too many believed too much. And because a new queen, upon entering one for the first time, stood before the largest mirror, smiled and said, "I like her better than me," then fainted. The room was sealed the next morning. So now as your eyelids begin to drift downward and your breathing slows, imagine this: a silent corridor, a door with an eye, a mirror waiting inside, humming softly with memory, and a eunuch standing at attention, not as a guard, but as a protector, because sometimes the danger isn't what you see, it's how much of yourself you're willing to meet, and sometimes the safest thing in the world is someone who watches you quietly, making sure you come back. So sleep gently tonight. No mirrors nearby, just dreams, and someone just outside the door keeping watch, the river where they drowned makeup kits. The river is still. You wouldn't expect that. You'd expect it to babble, to chatter over rocks and gossip with the reeds. But this river on this particular day is silent, like it knows something important is about to happen. And it does. Because today, dozens of women are standing at its edge, each holding a small wooden box. Inside, lip paints, blush, powder, kohl, tiny brushes and silver spoons, compact mirrors etched with flowers, the full cosmetic arsenal of Silla's noble class, packaged not for travel, but for sacrifice. One by one, they step forward and release the boxes into the water. The current takes them gently. No splashes, no ceremony. Just a quiet procession of painted wood drifting downstream like tiny boats, carrying the remains of vanity into the underworld. This is not about spring cleaning. This is a ritual called mulbyong, literally water sickness. But no one's sick, not physically. This is a spiritual cleansing, a mourning, a seasonal reset. And these cosmetics, they're the offering. Mulbyong was practiced during a very specific lunar alignment late spring, after the first planting but before the summer heat, a time when the living were believed to be most vulnerable to possession. Yes, possession. Not by demons. Silla didn't do demons the way other cultures did, but by fragments. Residual emotions, ancestral exhaustion. Ghosts who didn't want to harm you, but didn't want to leave either. The belief was that spirits clung to personal items, especially things that touched the skin every day. Hair combs, perfume bottles, makeup. So, once a year, women would gather and drown their cosmetic kits. Not because they were haunted, though some claimed they were, but because it was better to let the river take them than risk becoming a vessel for someone else's unfinished business. You don't wear a dead woman's eyeliner, not if you want to sleep through the night. The ritual had rules. First, the kits had to be prepared the night before, cleaned, wrapped in silk, blessed with incense. Second, each woman had to write a short note, a goodbye, something simple. "Thank you for hiding my fears. You made me beautiful on the worst days. I hope the river takes you somewhere kind." Then, at dawn, they would walk to the river's edge, remove their shoes, and step into the shallows just far enough to release the offering. And here's the part that gets weird. No one looked back, not once. To glance behind to see your kit floating away was said to invite the very spirits you were trying to cleanse. So they walked back up the riverbank, eyes forward, faces bare. And for one day each year, the court was full of women without makeup. The effect? Terrifying, liberating, possibly both. Historians still debate the origins of the ritual. Some trace it to an older shamanistic practice involving mirror burial. Others think it was a palace invention, an emotional purge disguised as spiritual hygiene. A few suggest it was a subtle act of resistance, because for women in Silla, cosmetics weren't just adornment. They were duty, expectation, armour. Painting your face properly was a sign of respect to your family, your ancestors, your gods. To strip it away even for one day was powerful, even political. And yet, it wasn't about rejecting beauty. It was about releasing it, acknowledging that something had built up, that grief had settled into the pigment, that old arguments had dried into the powder, that every morning spent smoothing a wrinkle or hiding a tremble had cost something, and it was time to let it go, into the river, where it could dissolve. One noblewoman's diary from the mid-8th century recounts a particularly intense mulbyong. I saw the face of my mother in my powder box last night. She didn't blink. I burned the box. But today, I bring another. I hope she forgives me. Chilling? Yes. Relatable? Possibly. The fear wasn't always literal. Sometimes it was just the weight of memory. The feeling that your reflection was more crowded than it should be. Mulbyong made space, but not everyone obeyed the ritual. Some refused to part with their kits, called it superstition or sentiment, or, in one famous case, an act of royal hysteria dressed in silk. That woman reportedly kept her cosmetics locked in a bronze chest under her bed. A month later, she woke up to find them opened. Carefully, lovingly, as if someone had been applying them. Except she lived alone. She performed the ritual the next day. In later years, the practice became rarer, especially as external influences reshaped Korean beauty culture. The old gods got quieter. The rivers were dammed. Cosmetics became industry, not intimacy. But even as the ritual faded, stories lingered. Temple texts speak of a section of the riverbank that still carries colour in spring. Reds, golds, pale pinks. Not from algae, they say. From pigment, from offerings, from memory. And now, in your quiet room, imagine this. You're standing at the edge of that river. You hold something small. A box. A mirror. A brush that no longer belongs to anyone. You whisper, "Thank you." You let go, and the water carries it gently away. You do not look back. You do not have to, because this is the ritual, and you have been released. Lice, lies, and lunar offerings. You wake up itching, not metaphorically physically. A tiny, persistent tickle just above your left temple. It could be your hair brushing the wrong way, or it could be something much, much worse. In Silla, an itch like that had only one explanation: spiritual parasites. Or, as we'd call them today, lice. Yes, even a kingdom of gold, incense, and eyebrowless priestesses had to deal with the ancient democratic horror of head lice. And in Silla, they didn't treat lice as a hygiene issue. Number, they treated them as an omen. You scratch again. Bad move. Because here, scratching could be interpreted as a confession. Let's rewind a bit. In the records of a 9th century temple, there's an entry that reads, "Lady Enwa arrived scratching her scalp. She confessed 3 lies before sunset. The moon accepted her." It seems odd hilarious even. That lice were considered a kind of moral signal. But in Silla, where the body was a map of spiritual status, any small disturbance could be interpreted as a cosmic nudge, especially when it was itchy, and especially when it came right before a lunar offering. Because the moon didn't just demand hair, as you remember, it also demanded truth. During the mid-moon festival, a minor yet widely feared ritual period, People were expected to make lunar offerings, not of food or incense, but of integrity. It was a spiritual audit, a cosmic accounting. You were supposed to approach the altar with a clear conscience and a clean body. If either one wasn't spotless, the moon would know. And if you entered the ritual with lice, well, you might as well announce to the heavens that you'd told a big fat lie and hoped no one noticed. The association was metaphorical, sort of. Lice, crawling in silence, feeding off you without consent, were seen as the physical embodiment of hidden guilt, shame you hadn't voiced, wrongs you hadn't righted. People who suddenly got infested before a moonrite were told to reflect, confess, apologise to the ancestors. Some even shaved their heads preemptively, just in case. Better bald than spiritually bloated. One of the more famous cases involves a high priestess who arrived at a royal lunar ceremony with a beautifully styled top knot only to freeze halfway through her prayer. She began scratching. Once. Twice. Then she burst into tears. The court held its breath. She confessed through sobs that she had borrowed sacred incense from a sealed temple cabinet and replaced it with cheaper powder. No one had noticed, but the moon did. She was stripped of her rank, voluntarily entered temple seclusion, and according to legend, never scratched again. Historians still can't decide whether this was religion or mass psychodrama, but Silla believed in signs, and lice were particularly theatrical ones. So the people developed rituals. You couldn't just remove the lice, you had to atone, and yes, you had to burn it outside, in full view of the moon. Because if you didn't, the next infestation would be worse, not just itchy symbolic. Of course, there were cheaters, people who faked lice to get out of lunar confession, or who claimed scratching fits as signs of divine possession. One court attendant reportedly faked a full-blown itching episode to cover for the fact that she had forgotten her lines during a ritual reading. She wasn't punished, she was promoted. Because in Silla, honest embarrassment was better than dishonest perfection. Still, the fear persisted, especially during the third moon alignment, a rare period every 19 years, when the moon was said to overlap with the constellation of ancestral memory. During this window, people were encouraged to stay indoors, whisper their confessions into mirrors, and sleep on clean mats. Even married couples were advised to sleep facing away from each other in case the moon overheard shared secrets. And if someone scratched, everyone looked away politely, then quietly increased their incense budget. Strangely, this blend of superstition and hygiene had real benefits. Silla's upper class actually had some of the most elaborate scalp cleansing rituals in the ancient world. Court women were known to carry personalized combs with tiny charms on them, small metal charms shaped like ears, eyes, or moons. Each one symbolized a virtue they hoped to maintain. The ear meant listening without judgment. The eye meant seeing truth in others. The moon, that was for honesty with oneself. Combs weren't just practical. They were moral reminders. You'd sit every evening detangling the day not just from your hair, but from your soul. One brush, one breath, one attempt at becoming a little less of a liar. So now, as you settle into the calm of your pillow and the scratch of the day fades from your skin and memory, imagine this. A silver comb. A moonlit room. A girl whispering her secrets into a folded paper packet. And the quiet hiss of honesty catching fire. Maybe you've lied a little this week. Maybe the moon noticed. But it's okay. You brushed. You breathed. You slept with your conscience open. So tonight, the lice are someone else's problem. Sleep well. And try not to scratch. The last woman with eyebrows in Gyeongju. They say her brows could slice air. Not literally, of course. Though, given the way stories grow over centuries, it wouldn't surprise anyone if someone once swore they saw her raise one, and the wind changed direction out of respect. Her name is mostly forgotten now. Some call her Lady Jinsen. Others just call her the last noblewoman in Silla to walk into a royal gathering with both eyebrows fully intact. Bold, defiant, possibly cursed. and absolutely unforgettable. You see, by the late unified Silla period, shaving eyebrows had become so ritualized, so deeply embedded in court customs, that not doing it wasn't just strange, it was heresy, or at least suspicious. And yet, Lady Jinson did exactly that. She walked into the spring ancestral ceremony of 933 CE fresh-faced, finely dressed, and flaunting two perfectly shaped, obviously unshaven brows. Sloped like mountain ridges, dark like brushstroke ink, arched just slightly enough to say, "Yes, I know what I'm doing. No, I don't care what you think." Gasps, silence, and then something, then worse. Polite coughing. Let's rewind. Lady Jinson was born into a declining noble house, once proud, now mostly paperwork. She had the education, the title, the ancestral shrine full of dusty relics, but not the clout, not the invitations, not the respect. So she tried something different. She studied the rituals, but not the way others did. She read between the lines. She noticed that nowhere did the sacred texts explicitly state that eyebrows had to be shaved. It was a custom, not a commandment. So she kept hers. At first, no one noticed. She was careful covering them with pale powder, avoiding strong lantern light. But eventually, someone saw. Probably during a tea ceremony. Eyebrows have a way of showing up, even when you hope they won't. A court attendant mentioned it quietly. A monk raised one of his ironically. And by the time the spring rites came, everyone knew. She had become a question. Now, imagine the ceremony. Nobles in pale robes, incense rising in careful lines, chanting so soft it feels like breathing. And in walks Lady Jinson, slow and poised, with her eyebrows leading the way. She bowed. No one bowed back. And still she stood in the line of mourners. Still she placed her offering on the altar. Still she gazed into the mirror, because of course there was a mirror, and did not flinch. The priest hesitated, then nodded. Because what could he do? The rules didn't say anything about this. After the ceremony, the rumours began. Some said her ancestors appeared in her dreams that night, furious. Others claimed they applauded her, whispering that finally someone had broken the cycle. A few said her eyebrows glowed faintly under moonlight. One servant claimed to have seen her brushing them with oil and powdered pearl, whispering prayers under her breath, not to gods, but to herself. Confidence was, after all, the most powerful ritual of all. But not everyone approved. One minister called her a spiritual disruption. Another accused her of cosmetic arrogance, a new term, hastily invented to explain why the court suddenly felt so unbalanced. She was summoned for questioning. They asked why she kept her brows. She said, "So I can raise them when someone lies." They asked if she feared the ancestors. She said, "I honour them with my life, not my face." They asked if she would shave them now for peace. She said, "I was born with them. Let the next world remove what this one fears." They didn't know what to do with her, so they did nothing, and that perhaps more than any rebellion was the greatest victory. She faded eventually, as all rebellions do. No more records mention her after that year. Some say she joined a mountain temple, where women practice quiet forms of resistance, wearing their hair loose, drawing birds instead of brows, praying in dialects no one remembered. Others believe she died quietly, in the city, her eyebrows greyed but unyielding. But every now and then someone reports seeing a woman older, cloaked, expression unreadable, at spring rituals in Gyeongju. And if you catch her gaze for just a moment, they say, you'll understand something about yourself that you'd been avoiding. And yes, she still has eyebrows. So now, as your breath evens out and your eyes begin to close, imagine this. A woman alone, but unafraid. A face unaltered, but no less reverent. A mirror reflecting not obedience, but self. Sometimes tradition whispers. Sometimes it demands. And sometimes it raises an eyebrow. Sleep well, and may your dreams be full of the strength to know which parts of you are sacred because you said so. Why the spirits finally stopped watching. It didn't happen all at once. You might think it did. That the gods and ghosts and gold-draped ancestors packed their incense-scented bags one night, floated over the mountains and never looked back. But that's not how silence begins. It seeps in, like water under a door, like dust into a scroll, like forgetting to say a prayer just once and realizing nothing bad happens. You're walking through Yongju again, but it's different now. The streets are wider, the rituals shorter, the mirrors a little more decorative, a little less terrifying. The old temple bells still ring, but they sound more like clocks now, not warnings. The air doesn't feel watched. Because the spirits, they've gone quiet. Some blame the wars, the invasions, the burning of libraries where rituals had once been recorded in perfect brush strokes. Others say it was the influence of new religions, Buddhism gaining structure, Confucianism arriving with stiff collars and stricter rules. The gods of the soil and sky didn't stand a chance against imported philosophy with footnotes, but maybe the spirits just got tired of being shaved for, painted for, feared and flattered in equal measure. Tired of mirrors and mumbles and women crying into bowls of rice because they forgot to bow at the right incense angle. Maybe they watched from beyond for centuries, hoping that reverence would turn into understanding, and when it didn't, they simply stepped away. It started subtly, an eyebrow forgotten, a blush applied slightly out of season, a ritual performed late because someone had a cold. No lightning struck, no dreams turned sour. The crop still grew, people noticed, not loudly, not publicly. But they began to test the silence. One woman kept her cosmetic kit after Mulbyong, another stopped shaving her brows during funerals and used the time to write poetry instead. A nobleman entered the mirror room and left laughing. He said, "I only saw myself. That was considered radical." The last recorded mirror seizure happened in 963 CE. A young acolyte stared too long, claimed to see a version of herself that had never apologized for anything, and collapsed. The temple closed the room, but when they reopened it a year later, nothing happened. The next 5 visitors saw only faces, their own, tired, curious, deeply human, and so the mirrors were turned to the wall. No ceremony, no weeping, just a quiet decision that perhaps they had served their purpose. The jars of eyebrows collected in mountain temples, gone, lost, cracked, buried in landslides. The women who painted their dreams on their cheeks, fewer and fewer. Until one year, the spring festival arrived, and no one shaved. That's how it ends. Not with rebellion, but with a shrug. With a generation too tired to carry rules that no longer made sense. With young women looking at their reflections and saying, "I don't think the dead are watching anymore." And the world didn't break. The moon still rose. The harvest still came. Even the lice seemed to take a break. But that doesn't mean the spirits are gone. Not entirely. They're still there, just quieter. Less interested in eyeliner. Less obsessed with shaved brows and moon-positioned braids. They've passed the torch to you, to how you remember them, not with trembling hands and sacrificial scissors, but with wonder, with laughter, with a raised eyebrow. Because perhaps what they wanted all along wasn't submission, it was storytelling, and now, in the silence they left behind, you've been listening, and they are satisfied. So here you are in the final light of Silla's long, strange ritual night. The gold has dulled, the incense has burned out, and the women, they smile more now. They walk past mirrors without bowing. They dream without painting it on their faces. And if the ancestors ever do return, let's hope they bring better makeup. Now, rest. Let the stories fade behind you like incense trails in a windy corridor. Let the images blur, painted brows, spinning dancers, mirror rooms, wax-sealed jars, and a queen, still glowing under moonlight, smiling with all her eyeliner intact. Because tonight the spirits are finally asleep. And so, dear listener, are you. Now breathe, slow and deep, like the hush between temple bells. You've wandered through a kingdom of painted dreams and polished silence. You've met women who whispered to mirrors and monks who guarded jars of ghosts. You've stood beneath comets, shaved your worries away, and made offerings to a moon that judged your hairstyle. But that's done now. Let your mind unwrap the last ribbons of ritual. Let the images loosen. The incense fades. The faces blur. There's no need to hold on to the customs anymore. You're not being watched. No one is waiting to critique your reflection or weigh the symbolism of your blush. Your dreams are your own now. So go ahead. Release the need to be symmetrical. Forget the rules of posture and powdered reverence. Sink into your pillow as if it were a ritual itself, soft, sacred, wordless. Let your breath become the only chant you need. And if, by chance, you feel a presence in the room tonight, don't worry. It's just history curling up beside you, a little strange, a little sleepy, just like you.